testified that to him, the exodus of the Serbs was orderly and that it was not mass chaos, people running in different directions. Moreover, Flynn and Akashi and the international media flew into Knin on 7 August via helicopter from Split, which means they must have overflown much of Sector South and certainly the Split military district portion of Sector South. And from the helicopter, Mr. Akashi, Mr. Flynn, and the international media all failed to see the, quote, massive burning of Sector South that the prosecution today claimed was taking place. Keep this in mind, Your Honors. All Sector South personnel was reporting to one boss. That was Yasushi Akashi and his office. It was Mr. Akashi's job to review these reports and assess their credibility, and then to take action with New York, UN New York, if in fact these reports were credible. Yet Akashi never claimed to the Croatian government that the United Nations believed there was a systematic campaign of burning and looting and killing taking place. In fact, on the 9th of September, Akashi reported to Annan in D-1662 that he told Šadinić he did not believe the Croatian government to be responsible for the crimes. In his witness statement, D-1646, Akashi told this court he did not consider the Croatian government to be behind the burnings, and if he had, he would have raised the issue with Šadinić. It would have been his duty to raise the issue with Šadinić if he received reports that the government was behind the burning and looting campaign. Your Honors, if the boss of the personnel in Sector South who was receiving these reports did not ultimately agree with the conclusions of his own personnel and never passed their allegations on to the UN in New York, the prosecution fails to explain why this trial chamber should find that their views of UN personnel in Sector South are not only credible, but that they are the only reasonable explanation of the evidence. Yet the prosecution insists that it was invisible ethnic cleansing, driving the Serbs out in a way to mask the real intentions of the Croatian leadership. The Secretary General filed a report with the Security Council on the 23rd of August, identified potential reasons for the departure of Krajina Serbs, and did not mention terrorization through shelling as a possible cause. The Secretary General must not have noticed the invisible ethnic cleansing in his report of 23 August, which is D90. This is exactly what we told you would happen in opening statements. We offer you the simple, straightforward explanation, while they offer you the convoluted conspiracy theory. You must decide whether to apply Occam's razor and whether the simple, straightforward answer is a, quote, reasonable explanation of the evidence. If it is, you must acquit. In our opening statement, you will recall that we cited to Judge Schomburg, who said when speaking of the prosecution's modus operandi, one can't help getting the impression that an arrest warrant is issued first and only afterwards do the actual investigations begin. At the time of opening statements, we could not have known how prophetic Judge Schomburg's observation would be. Indeed, 3 months into trial, and after many of its shelling witnesses had testified, the OTP filed its Rule 54 bis motion, looking for evidence of that which did not exist. There was no indiscriminate shelling. They told you in their opening statement that the indiscriminate shelling was, quote, at the core of the alleged JCE. It's transcript 443, lines 24 to 25. And yet, 3 months into trial, they sought the court's help in trying to find evidence to support this allegation. It is precisely because of the woeful lack of evidence against General Gotovina that the prosecution has had to change constantly its allegations like a locksmith with a ring of keys, furiously trying to find the right key that will unlock the door to a conviction. These changing allegations are evident from the prosecution's final brief, in which the prosecution no longer claims, for example, as it did in its pretrial brief, that, quote, in almost all cases there were no identifiable military targets, close quote, in Kneen and other towns. That's paragraph 31 of the prosecution's pretrial brief. Now, that was the prosecution case, and that is the case the defense was required to meet. Now the prosecution attempts to hold it against the Gotovina defense that we pointed out what potential military targets were in Kneen, Bankovac, Obrovac, and other areas. Indeed, it was not until November of 2008, 8 months into trial, that the prosecution submitted a new expert report from witness Koenigs and abandoned the theory that there were virtually no military targets in the so-called Krajina. Next, you were told by the prosecution in opening statements that the prosecution would prove beyond reasonable doubt through UNMO assessments that 73% of all houses in Sector South were destroyed after Operation Storm by the 13th of September. That's transcript 461, lines 11 to 13. In its final brief, the prosecution makes no serious effort to stand by that claim. Today, the prosecution tried to distance itself from the UNMO assessment, claiming that, quote, the prosecution is not claiming that the UNMO surveys represent a perfect and flawless account of the destruction. This is telling in the context of the prosecution's argument that international personnel in Sector South HQ were credible and didn't have a bias. In defending UN Sector South personnel, the prosecution this morning conveniently ignored other things that the personnel did, including tipping off the Krajina Serbs as to the start of Operation Storm. They ignored the evidence that during the operation, UNCRO was providing intelligence to ARSK commands. Furthermore, the prosecution now claims, contrary to its UNMO assessment claims, that, quote, larger towns were left relatively intact, close quote, and that's paragraph 157, and that it was the, quote, low-density rural environments, close quote, that suffered damage. That's paragraph 89. Now, in coming up with its theory that larger towns were spared to prevent or to colonize the area with Croats, but the rural areas were burned down so as to prevent the return of Serbs, the prosecution has never offered an explanation for why Serbs couldn't return to the larger settlements, or why the burning down of rural areas would have impacted Serbs, but wouldn't have impacted Croats living in these areas. You were told in opening statements that Serb civilians were, quote, marched and forcibly transferred out of their hamlets and villages, close quote, by Croatian soldiers and, quote, transferred to collection centers or detained with the objective of preventing them from returning to their settlements, close quote. That's transcript 465, lines 19 to 23. In its final brief and now final argument, the prosecution walks away from this claim and makes no mention of collection and reception centers. You were told today that PSYOPs and fake leaflets were effective in secretly encouraging Serb civilians to evacuate from Sector South. Yet, we can show Exhibit 13, yet when the prosecution is confronted with the Martić evacuation order, the prosecution argues the exact opposite. This is paragraph 641 of their brief. The ineffectual dissemination of the evacuation order reflected its ad hoc nature. Krajina civilians were unaware of the decision or any organized evacuation or otherwise did not refer to it in describing the circumstances of their flight. Witnesses who would be expected to be aware of this decision, such as police or hospital staff, were not. The prosecution, of course, can't reconcile how, on the one hand, civilians allegedly received leaflets telling them that there was an evacuation and they should follow the following routes, but on the other hand, when the issue is the Martich evacuation order, then there's no evidence that anyone knew anything about any evacuation. In short, the prosecution has never been able to find the key to open the door to a conviction, because there is no such key. But that obviously won't stop the prosecution from trying, no matter how absurd the argument advanced may be. One brief matter before we break, Mr. President: the burden of proof. The prosecution, in almost 400 pages of a final trial brief, and now 6 hours of argument, never once identifies what the burden of proof is, nor do they claim that they have met that burden. In the history of this tribunal, has the prosecution in any case ever filed a final brief and conducted a final argument without identifying its burden of proof or claiming that it has met that burden of proof? The prosecution's arguments are not analyzed as against the burden of proof. The prosecution's brief and arguments today are advanced as if we were still at the 98 bis stage, or worse, that all the prosecution has to do is establish reasonable doubt concerning General Gotovina's innocence. On the contrary, the prosecution must establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt, which the Martich Appeals Chamber said means that, quote, there is no reasonable explanation of the evidence other than the guilt of the accused, close quote. Measured against that exacting burden of proof, it is clear that the prosecution cannot prove that its interpretations are even plausible, let alone that they are the only reasonable explanations of the evidence. Your Honor, I have a new section. Perhaps this is a good time.
Yes, perhaps then it's better to start with that tomorrow. We adjourn and will resume